Went out camping a few years back with my cousins and I, when we experienced something beyond the realm of normal. We were just going for a weekend camping trip up a little ways out of my cousin's place. He lives miles outside of Alberta, Canada, and in the summertime, it's a pretty beautiful place to go and hang out. I remember it was me, my cousin, my other cousin, and a friend of his, and we were all wanting to get away for the weekend. Things went pretty normal for the most part, arriving at camp and setting up our tents. We planned to grill a bunch of good food and drink a bunch of beer. Things started taking a turn as we were setting up camp, when we began hearing weird screeching noises not too far away. We just thought it was maybe a weird bird or something, even though it didn't sound anything like a bird. It sounded really big, like a really big bird squawking and carrying on with a lot of other miscellaneous commotion. We all just wrote it off as it just being some animal or something like that, and we continued setting up camp. The rest of the afternoon and evening were pretty normal. We got a fire going, started cracking open some beers, and having a good time. As the sun was starting to set, my cousin and his friend decided to go walk off to get some firewood into the woods. My cousin and his friend hadn't been gone for more than a few minutes when they both came sprinting back as fast as they could, both pale as a ghost, screaming at me that some huge Batman thing flew down and tried to swoop them up. They pointed to me the area in which they went to go get wood, and said this thing came out of the trees and tried to grab his friend and flew back up. He said that this thing was huge, bigger than him or his friend. At first, I was thinking it was some elaborate joke that he was trying to pull on me, but then as he kept going on, I realized and sensed the emotion in his voice and on his face. He was genuinely terrified that something was wrong. The hair on my neck and arms began to stand up, and I didn't really feel safe anymore from that point on. I've never believed in monsters or any of that nonsense, but that doesn't mean there aren't animals that we don't know exist that maybe, just maybe, mankind has yet to discover. In my head, I'm thinking maybe some giant bat lives in the woods and try to eat both of them. We eventually get them both calmed down, and after about an hour or so, they start coming to and having a good time again. We quickly forget all about the Batman thing. I decided to go get some firewood from a different area from which they came, and had no issues myself, and as the sun was almost down, probably 2 or 3 hours from when my cousin initially had his experience, we started hearing those loud noises again. The best way I can describe it to you is these really deep, bassy squawks and noises. I'm not really sure how else to describe it. The only issue is this thing sounded so much closer to camp this time around. Saying that all of us were on edge is a complete understatement. Something was wrong. We were supposed to have each brought a tent, but we only ended up bringing 2, so we ended up piling up in both and calling it a night, with the sounds still going on and off in the distance. I can't speak for my cousins and their friend, but I had a pretty hard time falling asleep. But asleep I did fall eventually. The next thing I remember hearing is my cousin screaming. Me and my friend jumped out of our sleeping bag and then unzipped the tent as fast as we could. As I get outside my tent, I look directly to my right, and my cousin, who initially had the experience earlier, has a flashlight in hand and is shining it up in the tree at something. I took a second for my eyes to adjust, but he had this light on this creature in the same way you would have a spotlight on something. About 30 feet perched on a large branch, glaring at him, was this hideous, demonic bat-looking creature. I don't think I've honestly seen an animal so ugly. It had huge bulging red eyes. Not glowing red eyes, just naturally red eyes, kind of like some bats do. At least that's what it reminded me of. But it looked so sinister, so evil, and they were so large. The body looked more humanoid, but its wings were tucked in, and it had huge teeth from what we saw. Its mouth looked open. My cousin only had the light on this thing for a few seconds before it flew off into the night. But he just wouldn't stop screaming, and this thing kept glaring. After it flew off, I just told my cousins we're getting out of here right now. So we all got up and loaded everything right then and there and got out of there in the middle of the night. I don't know if that was a gargoyle. I don't know if that was a demon. And I'm not sure if it was some demonic bat. It not only freaks me out, but terrified my poor cousin, and we weren't going to risk hanging out any longer. As we were driving back, I was asking him why he was out of his tent, and he had told me he had gotten up in the middle of the night to go urinate, and he had heard some shuffling up in the tree by him, and so he shined his flashlight, and that's when he saw the creature. He believes this thing was stalking him all night, trying to get him again. He kept telling me how uncomfortable he was, and how he felt like something was watching him. I've never seen my cousin so pale before. Even though this happened a while ago, he still doesn't really like to talk about it. I think it was a little bit traumatic for all of us, to be honest. Hi. I have two weird occurrences that I wanted to share with you that happened to me both times I was visiting family in Arizona. The first was when I was driving late at night. I can't remember the exact road off the top of my head, since this was years and years ago, but it was really dark, as it usually is in Arizona at nighttime, with really no other traffic on the road with me. The stars were out, so there was some light illuminating the outside, but my headlights were the primary source of any light that could be seen. I'm driving along, and the next thing I see is this black figure swooping down from where I can only guess being the sky to right in front of me on the road, about 100 or so feet, and then take off again into the night sky on 2 feet. It literally looked like some black shadow of a person swooping down out of the sky, and then ran off the side of the road. It happened so fast, I wasn't really able to tell if it had wings or what it was. It spooked the living bejesus out of me. As soon as it swooped down, I slammed on my brakes, and then I see it kind of bolt off across the road, and I kind of just sat there in my car for a minute, not sure what to do. Eventually, I got the courage to keep driving, but it was still so odd. The next encounter I had was a few years later, and I was actually on my way back home. If I remember right, I was right near the Nevada border, and this was in broad daylight. I want to say roughly 1, maybe 2 p.m. in the afternoon. There were other cars on the road. I looked up out of my driver's side window and saw this figure floating there in the sky, probably no more than a couple 100 feet up. I had to double take it first. I figured it might have been a weather balloon or something like that maybe just happens to be in the shape of a person. But this looked like to be some black shadow of a person standing perfectly still in the sky. I couldn't see anything flapping or anything moving. It wasn't even doing anything. It was just perfectly still. I thought to myself, what the hell is that? It was hard for me to not want to look at it and to keep driving at the same time. I kept on driving, but periodically would look up at it to see if it would move. I never did see it move at all. I'm not sure what that thing was. I've been curious and I've tried to research into it just a little bit, and you'd be amazed at the amount of things there are on these strange occurrences. I guess there are such things as UFHs, unidentified flying humanoids. If you look this up on YouTube, there are literally hundreds of clips from what I saw. It's what looks to be a human figure just floating perfectly still in the sky for no rhyme or reason. Not only is it strange, but it strikes me as disturbing. I'm not sure what I saw, and I'm not sure what these things could be. Back around 10 or so years ago, when I was living in Ohio. Actually, I was living outside of Dover, just a little ways, and I was coming back at nighttime to my house. It was just me in the car, and my wife and kids were safely at home. Thank goodness. I'm driving along Highway 39 when what I can only describe as this huge figure with wings flies right down, right at my car. The first thing I noticed is these big red eyes glowing, and then this massive shape and wings flies right towards my car. It's like this thing charged me and flew right at me, and then bolted up towards the sky. It didn't make any sound, and I didn't hear or see anything prior, but I about shit my pants on the spot, and almost ran my car off the road. I only saw it for a few seconds. I don't know what the hell is that big with huge glowing eyes, but it scared the hell out of me, so I sped up as fast as I could, and then I began hearing a strange noise outside of my driver's side window. I looked and didn't see a thing, but I looked in my rearview mirror and saw that this thing was actually following my vehicle. As soon as I looked in the rearview mirror, I just see the glow of those two eyes not too far behind from my car, and the slight silhouette shadow that's been following me, flying low, keeping close by my car. I was so terrified I began crying, not sure what the hell this thing was, thinking it was some demon coming to take me to hell. In my panicked state of mind, I was freaking out, thinking this was going to follow me home and try to kill my wife and kids. So I detoured and drove around for a while, trying to lose this thing. I honestly have no idea when it stopped following me, because after I saw it initially in the rearview mirror, I refused to look anymore to see if it was still there. I must have drove around for another hour or two and realized it wasn't behind me anymore, nor was it following me. I still did not feel safe to drive home, but I was so exhausted I didn't feel I had a choice. As I pulled into my driveway and got out of my car, I was so nervous to even step out. I was frantically looking all around, thinking that this thing was going to be clung onto my vehicle or hiding behind a tree. I never did see it again, and I never told my wife and kids about what I experienced that night. About 7 or so years ago, I ended up falling on hard times and had to move in with my grandfather, who currently lived in Virginia. My grandfather had a lot of acreage and woods around his property, which made it wonderful to play in for my then 6-year-old son. I had just lost my job, so I had nowhere else to go at the time, and my grandfather openly invited me and my son to come live on his property. He had a spare room open, so it worked out perfectly. He had plenty of room, and I looked at it as a wonderful fresh start for me and my son. Or so I thought. We ended up staying in a room that was towards the end of the house, where when you first walk in, you have the living room area and then the kitchen. Then to your right is a really long hallway, with 2 bedrooms closest to the living room and the kitchen, followed by a bathroom. The hallway extended down a ways, and there was a bedroom we stayed in at the very far end to the left. My grandfather was pretty stern on not being outside the house after dark. I just figured he was old and was trying to scare my son into not going out at night, so he wouldn't get lost or attacked by animals. My son practically lived outside, so I could see why my grandfather would make this up. I didn't think much of it, so for the first few nights, My son played outside a lot, but as soon as it started to get dark, I kept him in. I remember I don't even think it had been a week yet since we had moved in, and I had fallen asleep to watching TV in the bedroom. My son starts crying hysterically and screaming and freaking out, and of course I wake up freaking out, and he's pointing outside the window, saying to me there's something trying to get him. I look out the window to where he's pointing to, and my jaw drops and I freeze. Not even 10 feet away from the window is what I can only describe as a gargoyle looking in right at us. This really ugly, demonic lizard-looking face glaring right back at us with glowing red eyes. I thought we were looking at a demon at first. In a moment of sheer fight or flight, I grabbed my son and ran out of the room to go wake up my grandfather, to go tell him there's some sort of being outside of our window. My grandfather was already awake from my son's screaming and crying. I guess that had woken him up, and he was worried what was going on. I quickly explained to him that there's something outside the window staring at us, and he immediately gave me the sternest look I think he's ever given me. He doesn't say anything and runs back into the room we were in. He comes out a couple minutes later, saying that whatever it was gone, and tries to help me console my sobbing son. It's about 2 or so in the morning, and after about a half hour or so, my son falls back asleep on the couch with me and my grandfather sitting there. After he falls asleep, my grandfather motions quietly for me to come with him. He pulls me into the garage and explains to me that ever since moving out onto this property, he says there's something evil that comes out at night around here. He tells me that he's seen it flying around the trees sometimes, and other times it will peep into the house windows. He explained that he's only ever seen it at night, and heavily reiterated the importance of staying inside during nighttime and keeping all windows closed and curtains closed. I, being genuinely terrified myself, but was in such shock of seeing this thing myself, I wasn't sure how to process my feelings on it. I don't think I said anything other than stare and nod. The next morning, I just told my son it was a bad dream, and we were going to go stay elsewhere. Luckily for me at the time, I had just gotten a really good job offer a couple towns over. I took it as quick as I could, and I ended up moving out of that place with my grandfather only a week or so later. The rest of the time I lived there, I kept the windows locked and the curtains closed, and never saw that thing again, and my son never did either. I didn't ever bring it up again to my son, other than telling him it was a bad dream, and he never mentioned it to anyone anymore. Once we moved out of there, my grandfather actually passed away roughly 2 years or so afterwards, I believe. And if I remember right, that property he lived on went into foreclosure. I'm not entirely too sure though. When I think back on it, it scares me still because he was really convinced there was some demon that was coming for him. He told me in detail how this thing had wings and would fly around and would bare its teeth, wanting him. He even told me that sometimes he would catch this thing stalking him and staring up at him from the trees as he would sometimes get home in the evening. Whatever it was haunted him and stalked him and that property till the day he died, or one could only assume. Hopefully, it's not still lurking in the property area. Not me, but seen by my brother, who is a truck driver. Late last August, while doing a route through Minnesota, he saw what he describes as a bat-human hybrid. He said this thing flew out in front of his truck on the road, about a few hundred yards, then after a second flew back up into the sky. Said this thing's body was just plain weird looking. He called it a science experiment gone wrong, based alone on its physical features. He wasn't able to see the face super well because it flew a ways into the road in front of him, but it had a longer horse-like head, is what he said. He said the body reminded him of a person, but was all black, hairy, and had large bat-like wings on the back. No tail was seen either, and said that this thing was fast. It took off from the road in an instant, and as soon as this thing flew out in front of his truck and landed a ways away in the road. As a semi-truck, you can't just stop because of the sheer weight and momentum behind you, so he was slamming on his brakes to try and slow down, and as he was, this thing flies off in a split second. He's still so perplexed as to what it could have been that he saw. He's still convinced it was some government man experiment that escaped. I was out treating my parents to a nice dinner since I had just bagged a new job and was making a killing. I wanted to give back to my parents and treat them to something nice. We ended up going out to this really nice restaurant where my dad drank himself silly in fine wine and ended up passing out on the way home in the back seat of the car while I drove. My dad was in the back seat, my mom's in the passenger side, and I'm driving. We're just talking casually when we come around a bend in the road and catch a glimpse of this demon-looking bat creature. My headlights lit it right up, and my mother and I got a good look at this thing before it took off into the night. It was just getting dusky, so it wasn't super dark just yet, but the sun had begun setting, so there was still somewhat good visibility in the road. When my headlights hit this thing on the side of the highway, my mother and I both gasped as we were shocked at what we were looking at. This thing was eating a dead deer that had been sitting on the side of the road. The same dead deer we all passed when driving to the restaurant earlier, so I know it was a more fresh kill. As soon as my headlights hit it, it looked right up at the car. It stood up and flew off. As soon as it stood up, my mom began panicking, saying, "What is that thing?" Before it flew off for that brief second, I thought it was going to come after our car. I immediately slowed down in time for this thing to fly off. My best description of what we saw is this. It was slightly hairy, a dark brown light fur covering its whole body. I would guess it only stood about 4 to 5 feet tall and had large bat-like wings with a membrane and all. They were outstretched and even flapped a couple times before flying off. It didn't have any ears that I saw, but had a weird, deformed-looking face with a short-looking snout and a lot of long teeth. I couldn't really make out the eyes. They looked black, but I'm only guessing. I was only about 30 or so feet away from this thing, and it happened over the course of 5 to 10 seconds. So I saw a lot of details, I feel. I couldn't see its feet because it was standing behind the dead deer. It looked like it had lanky arms with big white claws at the end of them. I'm not sure if it had hands or what. I do vividly remember it having blood on its mouth and chest from eating the roadkill. After it flew away, my mom and I just looked at each other, not sure what to do or say. I just kept driving and didn't say a thing. My dad was still passed out through the whole thing, so he was never even aware. My mother and I keep it to ourselves and have never told him about it.